Yeah, so with the job order costs, we're going to keep track of costs by job, right? So you could imagine like a maybe even a contractor that goes out and works on different houses. They're going to compile their costs by each house that they're working on, or each project, right? Okay. And all of the projects, as soon as they're started, they would start a subsidiary account in the work in process account for each job. So you could have several jobs that are sitting in this work in process account. A lot of times they have job numbers, so it might be like job number 124, maybe job number 135, so on and so forth. And each job would have a job ticket or a job cost sheet that would track the direct material, direct labor, and manufacturing overhead related to each of those jobs. So you could imagine the support for this account work in process would be made up of several of these records, if you want to say, by job number. Okay. So I won't build the whole thing, but it probably would have columns. And let's see, we'll make something look like that real quick here. Okay. And you could tally up the cost for each job on its individual record. So you would have direct material costs, direct labor costs, manufacturing overhead costs, and then you probably would have a total lying down at the bottom. Okay. So that's not a T account, that's just a record that makes up what's going into the work in process account. Okay, so actually we should move that, maybe move that down and out of the way. But it would be by job number. So just as an example, you might have job number 140, okay? And then depending on the number of jobs you have, you would have a record for each of those individual jobs. Okay. So this is the way it works. When we buy raw material, right, we put it into the raw materials account. It would be debited. So purchases of raw material end up as debits in the raw material inventory account. Okay. Now, as they're used in individual jobs, as that material is used in individual jobs, we're going to move it. We're going to move it out of raw material and put it into work in process. Okay. So when we know that, when we know the specific amount that goes to a particular job, that would be called direct material, because we know exactly how much is needed for each job, so it's going to go directly to that job. Okay. Now there's instances where you have material that you can't trace individually to each individual job, but you know you need it, and you need it for all jobs. So whenever we have that type of material being utilized, it won't go directly to work in process. It's gonna come out of let me see how I do this. These things used to, right, it's gonna come out of it'll come out of raw materials, and it's going to go down to manufacturing overhead. Okay? So when that happens, that's called indirect material. So the stuff that's still part of the manufacturing process, but we can't trace it directly to an individual job. Okay? So two places that material can go, right? Now, any direct labor, right? Any direct labor, we can book it and charge it directly to work in process. Okay, so direct labor, and then you probably would be crediting wages payable, just like you would with any type of payroll transaction. We'll call this direct labor. Okay, so that's an increase to work in process. So far, so good? Yep. Okay. Now, the thing with overhead, and I was expanding on it earlier today when I was talking to some people. You see, overhead is all of the indirect stuff. Okay. So any indirect labor would end up going to the overhead account. Okay. It would come down here as indirect labor. Okay. And then there could be other overhead items. So things that go into overhead, they are part of the product, part of the job, but we can't get a direct relationship. We can't say that it takes 2 pounds of indirect material to make each computer unit, right? Or it takes 15 hours of indirect labor to build this house. Okay, we know we need this, but it's different than direct labor, where we know that it takes so many hours per roof, and so on and so forth. Okay, so what happens is, if you look closely at this overhead account, we're accumulating the overhead amounts on the debit side. Okay, but the thing is, these jobs need to absorb some of this overhead, so we need to allocate. So when we allocate overhead to different jobs, we have to estimate it. Okay, sometimes they call it applied, but we'll call it allocated. So what's happening, and I'll highlight that. This allocation is an estimate. Okay, I'll make a note here. Overhead is allocated to individual jobs based on a predetermined, which is an estimate, overhead rate. So a lot of times they'll tie it to something like direct labor, right? You know, certain jobs need so much direct labor. We're going to make that a percentage of the direct labor cost, or a percentage of the direct labor hours, okay? Because it kind of makes sense. The logic is there. If this job requires more direct labor, then shouldn't it absorb more of the overhead costs? Okay, so that's the logic they're using. The thing is, you're never going to hit it right on the nail, because you're actually accumulating actual overhead here on the debit side simultaneously, or not in sync with the allocation. The allocation could actually happen before you've captured all of the actual overhead amounts. So you're applying this overhead on an estimated basis, okay, where you continue to accumulate actual amounts, but when it gets to the end of the accounting period, let's just do this. We draw a line here, and we take a balance, right? There's a chance that you either over applied, okay? And if you over applied, then your account is going to have a credit balance, because that means you had more credit than debit, so you put more to the jobs in total than you actually accumulated, or you would have under applied or under allocated. Okay, so depending on whether it's a debit or credit, we'll put a little. Yeah. You could have over applied or under applied. Okay. let's just keep in mind too, or remember that the raw materials account the work in process account and the finished goods inventory account, they're all inventory accounts. Okay, I'll just abbreviate there. So we got 3 inventory accounts happening. All right. Okay, now as jobs are completed, remember jobs, this work in process could be made up of several jobs. As the jobs are completed, they're going to move, right? Completed jobs are going to move out of work in process, and they're going to move into finished goods. Okay, so it would basically be a debit to finished goods and a credit to work in process. Okay. And then finally, as we sell the jobs, as the jobs are sold, right, they're going to move out of finished goods, just like we've been doing. We credit inventory and we're going to debit cost of goods sold. So they'll be, right, we'll just say sold jobs. Okay. So they move through the system that way. Kind of like that. Okay. So that's a job order cost system. And that's, what did we say, chapter 17, right? Yes. Okay, now chapter 18 is going to be what we call a process costing system. So instead of tracking everything with a job ticket like this, like I was saying, we had, like, we could have several jobs going on, right? It wouldn't just be job 140, and you would have a separate ticket for every job. Maybe there's a job 141. It could be endless, right? We're not gonna, in process costing, we're not gonna track it by job. We're gonna track it by process. So it's different because when you start talking about tracking things by process, then all of a sudden you could have several different processes, right? You could, like, if take for instance the maybe a soup company, right? They have the stewing department, and then they have the canning department. They might have the labeling department, and they might have the packaging department. Okay, so with a process costing system, you're probably going to have these accounts, but you're probably going to have several work in process accounts. And those work in process accounts are probably going to be for each department that touches the items that are being manufactured. Okay? But we can save that for chapter 18.